Good morning, folks. I am Dr. Weiss, and today I'm going to be talking about modernism. Periodically through this presentation, I might be standing over here and looking downwards. You can't see it in your screen, but I'm looking at a computer, so it's not, I'm sort of losing my attention and phasing out here for a moment, but I'm looking at some information. So modernism, and maybe I say this with every literary genre that I talk about. I don't think that I do. But modernism is definitely one of my favorites. When I was a student at Michigan State University in the early 90s, I had a senior class in modernism. And I believe my professor's name was Dr. Martin. I'd lost touch with him a couple of decades ago. It was one of my favorite classes. We learned about Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and William Faulkner and all sorts of these, great literary texts. And some of them I'm going to reference today. It was just an astonishing class. And I always think about that when I am presenting my material on modernism and some of the texts that I teach subsequent to the presentation that I'm giving today. Modernism, once again, to sort of make sure we understand the terminology. Modernism is a literary and artistic, philosophical, even a musical genre that took place roughly between 1915, I have 1915 and 1945. These dates are flexible. They are not etched in stone. There are writers from the late 19th century that display literary texts or engage in modernism even though it comes before 1914 or 1915. So literary genres, artistic genres are always fluid. And they don't necessarily coincide with other countries at those particular times. So maybe American Romanticism lasts a little bit longer than it does in Europe. And that doesn't even account for other countries around the world that may not engage or may not describe in their literary text the same sorts of characteristics that we're going to talk about in modernism today. I also want to differentiate modernism as, and I'll continue to call it a literary genre because I'm going to focus on literature today, as a literary genre versus the word modern or modernity. Modern or modernity are terms that we probably use in our everyday language from time to time, and those are relative terms. What do I mean by that? Well, if I say that you are living in a modern time, that modern time could be today. It could be the 21st century. It could also be if you were living 3,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia in the kingdom of Uruk, and this figure of Gilgamesh, real or fictional, more real than I think fictional, that Gilgamesh was your king in the kingdom of Uruk, you were living in a period of modernity because the time period before that is older, and the time period that you're living at the current moment is the most modern to you. So modernity and living in a modern time are relative terms. Modernism is a literary and artistic genre. Okay, so some differences, and very often these shifts in literary genres, these movements from one genre to another genre, are a result of historical forces and a result of a critique of social forces or history. Whatever was occurring before, these are often reactions against or form out of those earlier periods. So we have the pre-modern world. What is the pre-modern world? Before modernism, it was ordered, it was meaningful, it was, to some degree or another, optimistic, stable. There was faith, there was morality, there were values. There was more or less a clear sense of identity. The modern world, the early 20th century, chaotic, futile, pessimistic, fluctuating, a loss of faith, a collapse of morality and values, a confused sense of identity and place in the world. How did we get to that place in the early 20th century? We're going to get there. Literary modernism's most significant feature is experimentation, both in style and subject matter. An important poet of the time, Ezra Pound, had a scarf, and on his scarf he had it embroidered, "Make it new." The phrase "make it new" is attributed to Ezra Pound, became a rallying cry for writers who participated in this cultural movement. The kinds of literature that was produced in the early 20th century was new, it was experimental, it was varied, and I would argue, at least for us as modern readers, as readers today, maybe the most influential. It feels modern. We don't have too much difficulty reading, as opposed to reading maybe an early 19th century text or a 17th century text that sounds and feels old to us. But texts from the modern period, for the most part, feel more modern to us, and I think really speak to us in many ways. Let's continue. Characteristics. A sense that our culture has no center, no values, that there's a paradigm shift from the closed, finite, measurable, cause and effect universe of the 19th century. If we do this, something is going to happen. That seems commonsensical. People living in this modern period, the modernistic period, in modernism, the early 20th century, didn't have that sense. And if we think about this in terms of trauma, and often in my classes we talk about psychoanalytic theory and trauma, and I do have a presentation on that. But one of the sort of tenets, the difficulties, the complexities about trauma is that our faith, our trust in the world has changed. And this was very much the case in the early 20th century. Perspectivism. Meaning comes from the individual's perspective and is thus personalized. A single story that might be told from the perspective of several different people. A narrator. And when we have a narrator, and I think the classic example of the early 20th century in modernism, in literature, of a story being told by a narrator is The Great Gatsby. Nick Carraway telling the story of Jay Gatsby. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together, quote, that Nick Carraway tells Jay Gatsby. Is this Jay Gatsby's story? Is this Nick Carraway's story? Is this the story of The Great Gatsby as told through the eyes of Nick Carraway, and what kind of perceptions does he have? What kind of prejudices does he bring? What does he remember? What does he forget? What is important? What is not important to the narrator? Modernism underscored the unconventional, largely uncertain ethic brought on by rapidly changing technology and dramatic cultural shifts. Modernism argued for cultural relativism. People make their own meaning in the world. Inner psychological reality is represented by the stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness being a technique developed in the early 20th century, a move away from realism. In the 19th century, realism being a journalistic, describe the world of the everyday. Stream of consciousness was about the interior perspective. Writers such as Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, William Faulkner, these writers were interested in understanding the thought processes, how the interior world of the individual has a life of its own. In fact, James Joyce was just simply interested in the processes of how we think. And here's an excerpt from James Joyce's Ulysses, which always, or most often, shows up as one of the greatest books written in the English language, shows up as one of the greatest books of the 20th century. James Joyce, a very important writer in modernism, an extremely important writer in the Irish literary tradition. Let me read you a portion of this that illustrates this stream of consciousness. Yes, because he never did a thing like that before, as asked to get his breakfast in bed with a couple of eggs since the City Arms Hotel, take a breath, when he used to be pretending to be laid up with a sick voice, doing his highness to make himself interesting for that old Mrs. Riordan that he thought he had a great leg of, and she never left us a farthing, all for masses for herself, and her sole greatest miser ever was actually afraid to lay out for her methylated spirit, telling me all her ailments, so on and so forth. What do we notice about this? Run-on sentences. Sentences that if we were to sort of slice this up into independent clauses, they're not all going to be independent clauses. There's going to be fragments. James Joyce in Ulysses was about the interior mind and what your thinking sounded like. When I was a student in the early 90s, I lived in Ireland, and one of the many authors that we studied, of course, was James Joyce. And I recall I was at the Dublin Writers' Museum on the far end of O'Connell Street, and we could only take 3 or 4 pages of Ulysses at a time. It was not a text that you could just sit down and read for an hour or two, because it had to be dissected if we wanted to understand what was going on, not only in terms of plot, but also in terms of substance. Okay, language. Our understanding, the modernists had a different understanding, or they're developed, not just in modernism in terms of literature, but also in terms of psychology and sociology and in linguistics. Understanding of language changes, no longer seen as transparent, allowing us to see through reality. Considered the way an individual constructs reality. So what does this mean? Well, the sort of classic example of how culture understands language are the Inuit Indians of the Arctic, and that they have 22 or 23 different words for snow. Now, in English, if we want to talk about snow, we might say it's fluffy snow, or it's heavy snow, or it's awful snow, or whatever you might say. So we're adding adjectives to snow. But in other languages, the word snow has already been divided. So does that mean that that culture understands snow differently than we do? This might be more familiar to us. In certain languages, perhaps like Spanish, there is a difference when addressing somebody if you're using a familiar form or a formal form or an informal form. Embedded in the language, as this argument would go, embedded in the language, that the difference, that a social hierarchy is recognized not only socially but linguistically. So language is thick with multiple meanings and varied connotative forces. That language was becoming a limited tool. What do I mean by language is a limited tool? And this was something that the modernist writers, I think, recognized. It was a limited tool. Have you ever tried telling a story to somebody and you stop midway through the story and you say, you know what, forget it. You're not going to get it. You have to be there. Why is it that midway through the story, or whatever you stop, you say that you can't tell the story anymore? Because the person that you are telling, you think, is not going to understand what it is that you're trying to say. This is a failure in language, that you don't have the words to communicate all of that which you want to communicate. Where did this arrive from? We'll talk about this in just a moment, but it arrived from primarily from war. The Sapir-Whorf theory of linguistics, about 1929, Sapir and Whorf were interested in language, and they posited this theory that a particular language and culture shapes reality. Okay, now there are certain aspects of this theory that modern linguistics have moved away from, but that I think is the essence, that the kinds of language that we use in a particular culture shapes the way that we understand the reality of the individual within that culture. Novels of the 1920s. I think a handful of these novels we might be familiar with. The 1920s arguably is one of the greatest decades in literary production. Let's go through some of this list. We might be familiar with some of these. Jean Toomer's Cain, Edith Wharton. Has anybody read any Edith Wharton? I love Edith Wharton. Such an important, now she is sort of spans a couple of different literary genres, but she wrote in the 1920s, Age of Innocence, Summer, Ethan Frome, Really a fantastic writer. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, The Beautiful and the Damned, Herman Hesse, Siddhartha, William Carlos Williams in The American Grain, Theodore Dreiser, An American Tragedy. I mean, An American Tragedy is, sort of one of the great American novels like The Great Gatsby, An American Tragedy about a nephew working for his uncle and wanting to climb up and within the corporate structure. And in order to do that, he has to get rid of some things that are obstacles to him, mainly a lover who has become pregnant. It's about murder, criminality, the American dream, all of those sorts of things. Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, and To the Lighthouse. I would argue that one of the most impactful, one of the most powerful images of modernist writing comes from Mrs. Dalloway. This image of a beautiful crocus with a fire inside of it. Really a symbol of war, a symbol of the apocalypse. W.B. Yeats, A Vision. Irish writer, beautiful, beautiful poet. I'd put him definitely on your list of writers to take a look at. Gertrude Stein, The Making of Americans. And this was written a little bit before, but this is also not just about the 1920s, but the great literary texts of modernism. The Making of Americans is this large volume, 600 or 700 pages or so, and could it be shortened to 200? Maybe, in terms of plot, but it's the process of reading, which is part of the experience of getting to where you have to be. Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms. Isn't it pretty to think so? Willa Cather's Death Comes from the Archbishop, Ford Maddox Ford, Parade's End, William Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury, James Joyce, Ulysses, and Remarquet's All Quiet on the Western Front. So what is this historical context? I've been talking about a collapse of identity, a fragmentation of identity, filtering reality through language, filtering reality through subjectivity, all of those sorts of things. What is this all about? Why have we moved from describing things in the everyday with a journalistic eye in 19th century realism? How did we get to modernism? Primarily World War I, from 1914 to 1918. World War I was a period of time that fractured people's understanding of reality. I spoke a few moments ago, I mentioned trauma. This was, in many ways, a worldwide trauma. Now, the United States did not get involved in World War I until 1917. Prior to 1917, however, Americans, including American writers like Ernest Hemingway, went over into Europe and fought for some of the Allied armies, or like Ernest Hemingway, joined an ambulance group in Italy. What was it about World War I? Well, in the later part of the 19th century, middle to the end of the 19th century, in terms of technology, we have the development of repeating rifles, of course, which were used during the Indian Wars in the late 19th century in America. We have the development in the late 19th century of the Gatling gun, the development of tanks, of bombs, of first-generation airplanes, machine guns, all sorts of ways where technology was pushed, all sorts of ways to kill people. And to kill people on a scale that the world had never seen before. This was a fight about, the sort of quintessential fight between good and evil. But this was not in metaphor. This was in the blood and trauma of hundreds of thousands and millions of people all over the world. And it was because of this that people said, whoa, what just happened here? An anecdotal story, Gertrude Stein and her girlfriend Alice B. Toklas were with a mechanic in Paris, and this was a period of time where many writers left their country of origin. You had a painter like Picasso leave Spain for a period of time to go to Paris. Ernest Hemingway lived in Paris. James Joyce left Ireland. And James Joyce said he had to leave Ireland in order to have perspective and understand what Irish culture was. And that's what a lot of these writers did. They got together. They were expatriates. They left their countries of origin. Many of them congregated in Paris, and they were disillusioned. So this anecdotal story, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas are at a mechanic, and this mechanic says in French, which I will spare you, "You are all a lost generation." And this in part became, along with Ezra Pound's "Make It New" on one side, and also "You are a lost generation" on the other side. This describes the experience that that the writers and thinkers and artists during modernism and people during the early 20th century were experiencing. You are a lost generation. People didn't know what to do. They didn't understand what the future was. They didn't understand themselves in this historical moment. Chemical warfare, chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. Chlorine and phosgene would asphyxiate you. And these were terrible things, not used in the sorts of quantities ever in armed conflict as they were used during trench warfare in Europe during World War I. Some of the symptoms that you might experience, you would suffocate, but not necessarily at the time of exposure. Maybe later on that day, the lungs would become inflamed and you would choke to death, or maybe even the next day. Mustard gas would burn you, and that had an effect as well. You might not be burned at that particular moment of exposure. These were technological advances, in the technology of death. And people had not seen this before. Trench warfare, where people lived, where soldiers sort of existed in these horrible conditions. They talk of rats the size of dogs. And they grew to such large numbers and large size because they had a plentiful food supply. They ate cadavers, ate the dead. They ate horses and all of those sorts of things. So the technology, progress, machine guns, tanks, submarines, airplanes, flamethrowers, and poison gas. Technology could be used for mass violence. And this in part pushed the confusion of language. How could these horrific experiences be described? In fact, there was new language to describe. On one hand, there weren't the words that could adequately describe this experience. On the other hand, there were new words that were created in the attempts to describe these things. For instance, the expression booby trap. Now, we sort of think of that as not all that serious, but booby trap was an explosive device that was disguised in something mundane, maybe like a box or a shoe. Cooties. Now, we sort of use that expression, at least in America, lightheartedly. Oh, do you have cooties? Cooties was something in the early 20th century that was really much more serious. Cooties described somebody that might have been full of parasites or bacteria or lice. This was named after a bird called the coot, and the coot was a bird that was known to be full of parasites. And one that I think most of us would be familiar with, the basket case. And some of us have used this expression before. I have so much homework, I'm a basket case. Now this is used, not necessarily facetiously, but to describe a particular psychological feeling that you have, maybe of being overwhelmed. What was a basket case? This was a term that was popularized during this time period, early 20th century. The basket case was somebody that had stepped on ordnance or had been exploded, and their body parts were spread out over some space, and somebody needed a basket to pick up all of your body parts. In that context, you were a basket case. And I also want to speak just for a moment again to give us another example of language. In Paul Fusel's study of called The Great War and Modern Memory, he talks about during World War I the stand-to, where soldiers at dawn and soldiers in the evening would watch the sun rise and the sun set. This was a very ritualized behavior, and ritual is very, very important in all sorts of contexts. Ritual is a set of choreographed activities, movements in some way, associated with, again, a large variety of contexts in terms of burial. Ritualized behavior for the burying of the dead in part allows us to begin the grieving process. Well, ritual also helps us, helps culture, helps people make sense or to have some control over a chaotic world. I can't control what's going on out there, but I can control what's going on over here. And you, as a part of my religion or my culture or whatever group that I'm a part of that you are also a part of, you understand these rituals, and so this helps build community cohesion, again, against the sort of chaos of the world. So soldiers during World War I would do this stand-to, and they would watch the sunrise and they would watch the sunset. And most often this ritual behavior was not accompanied by talking. In one way, we could consider that these soldiers engaged in this ritual silently, because they didn't have the words to describe the experience that they had been through. Shell shock, another word from the early 20th century. To describe their shell shock, their trauma, the words to describe the horror of the war. Now, Fussell has a slightly different argument for that. He says that they stood in silence during these ritualized behaviors because war is about action and memory is silence. Okay? But this is about language, I think. Lots of things going on, late 19th, early 20th century. Revolutionary ideologies rise. Fascism, Nazism, communism. All these different isms as a kind of response to historical forces, social forces in various countries. Perhaps in a response to the disconnection between understanding self and reality, the disconnect between understanding self and these historical and social forces, the disconnect between understanding self and technology. Technology, I would argue, in many ways moves us away from understanding ourselves. As a famous transcendentalist said in the 19th century, we have become tools of our tools, and perhaps this is working for the modernists and this historical period as well. Socially, 1914, we have World War I. 1919, Prohibition. 1920, women gain the vote in the United States. 1929, this is beginning the age of the Great Depression, echoes of which we have felt, I have felt in my lifetime, and who knows what is going to go on today. 1939, World War II begins in Europe, and let me back up for a moment. 1930, 1936, the Dust Bowl devastates Western states. So these are some other historical moments that take place in this early to mid 20th century. Scientific revolution, quantum theory, 1905, explains the nature of matter and energy on the atomic or subatomic level. We have the principle of uncertainty in quantum mechanics. Increasing the accuracy of measurement of one observable quantity increases the uncertainty with which another may be known. That's a lot for us to sort of understand. But these scientific, these new understandings in science also, in some ways, deconstruct previous notions of reality and lend itself, along with the difficulty we have with language in World War I, as destabilizing forces. This speaks to the nature of reality. There begins to develop this theory of many worlds. As soon as the potential exists for any object to be in any state, the universe of the object transmutes into a series of parallel universes equaling the number of possible states in which an object can exist. That's some pretty heavy stuff. Copenhagen interpretation, nothing exists until it is measured. And we have the example, an example here, Schrodinger's cat, which you might be familiar with from, there was a TV show. Now it slips my mind. But Schrodinger's cat, that a cat could exist simultaneously as being both dead and alive. So a cat goes into a box, hypothetically, into a box. There's a mechanism that can produce the cat's death, but the cat theoretically could be both alive and dead because we don't know what the cat's state is until the cat's state is measured, till you open up the lid of the box. In 1899, we have Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams, a lengthy volume on how to understand dreams and the unconscious. This all corresponds with language. And if you think about how language works with Sigmund Freud, with the beginning of the talking cure, and maybe this is a good example also of how language has limitations. What is it that we do when we are having a difficult time? We go talk to somebody. Freud called this the talking cure. But you go talk to a therapist, you go talk to some sort of clinician, a social worker, even if you go home and talk to your significant other. You could say, yeah, I'm having a bad day, let me just get this off of my chest. Or if you're having more than a bad day. Why is it that we can't go and see a clinician and say, I am feeling depressed because this happened? And you say that, and then all of a sudden you feel better. Rather, in the clinical situation, you might have to go back to that clinician over and over and over again, which, by the way, is important to do because it is difficult to get resolution to a variety of different things. But why is it that you cannot just go there and say, I'm having a bad day, or this happened, or someone died, and I need to get it off my chest, and you do so, and then you're all better? Because there is a kind of disconnect between language, the tool that we use to communicate, and the substance that which we wish to communicate, particularly that stuff which also might be stored in the unconscious. You may have to go back for years saying the same thing over and over and over again, trying to explore, trying to say things in different ways in order to get that resolution. That, I would argue, in some ways, is an example of the limits of language. All right, what else do we have? Themes of modernism. Language, subjective tools, we've been talking, failure, experimentation, various social issues, destruction and chaos. Existentialism. Modernists rejected traditional philosophical and religious systems of belief. This, I would say, again, often these genres are a reaction against. Romanticism is a reaction against the Enlightenment. Modernism is a reaction against Victorianism and realism of the 19th century. The writing might suggest a meaningless, chaotic, and godless world. Existentialists believe that the individual has the sole responsibility for giving his or her life meaning and living life passionately and sincerely, in spite of many obstacles and distractions, including despair, angst, absurdity, boredom, and death. Continuing with themes that exist in various modernist texts, alienation, disillusionment, and separation from culture, country, community, and self. The American dream. As I said earlier, Dreiser's An American Tragedy, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. There are Nathaniel West, The Day of the Locust. There are a whole host of novels that deal with, particularly in America, that deal with the American dream. Since the 19th century, again, in America, we've seen the first breadlines, the first real divisions between the wealthy and those who are not wealthy. This has increased exponentially in the last 30 years, in the last 5 years, but this has been a trend since the late 19th century, and writers in the early 20th century began to write about this. What was this thing called the American dream? that this overarching ideology, this philosophy, that if you come to America and you work hard and you can get ahead. Robert Merton in 1938 came up with this idea in sociology of anime, that in America the power to gain, to have material wealth outweighed the potential of punishment and incarceration. Okay, anime, the American dream. Modernists wrote about these themes. Fragmentation of subjectivity, fragmentation of reality. Modern art. Prior to the 19th century, artists were most often commissioned to make artwork by wealthy patrons or institutions in the church. Art had been religious, mythological, or biblical. During the 19th century, many artists started to make art about people, places, or ideas interested, or things that interested them. Direct experience, the everyday. In modern art, there's a tendency toward reflexivity or self-consciousness about the production of the work of art. Let me skip down a little bit. Modernist artists, they reject elaborate formal aesthetics in favor of minimalist designs. Reject, in large part, formal aesthetic theories in favor of spontaneity and discovery in reality, discovery in creation. Art is artifact rather than reality. In different movements within modernism, primitivism, cubism, futurism, constructivism, surrealism. We're going to look at a few of these and look at a few paintings. During this presentation, we don't often get to do this, to look at art, but I have some images here that we can look at. Primitivism, a sensibility or cultural attitude that has informed diverse aspects of American art, specific stylistic elements of tribal objects and other non-Western art forms, a belief in the value of what is simple and unsophisticated. Very famous painting within this modernist period, within primitivism, Paul Gauguin's Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? The very end of the 19th century. You can see this is not representing reality perfectly in all of its detail. In this primitivist form, interested in the simple. And if you think that makes sense as a reaction to industrialization and technology and the disconnect between the human experience and technology and trauma, to go back to things that are more simple. And was that something that was possible to do in Europe or in America? I mean, in the early part of the 19th century, late 18th century, you had the Romantic movement like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, writing about the rustics, simple farmers and peasants and things like this. Was something different. This was sort of left behind. Modern culture and modernism was overwhelming. And various artists, including Paul Gauguin, began to look at other cultures that exemplified this idea of simplicity. Gauguin's The Spirit of the Dead, 1892, another important example of primitivism. Emile Nolde's Young Men of Papua New Guinea, 1914. You can see sort of the broad strokes, the vibrant colors here. This is these quote-unquote primitive peoples, if you will. Primitive insofar as not part of industrialization, a simpler time, a better connection. Here we see a better connection to nature. But these are not people that think primitively. And oftentimes, and this is a very pejorative term, that is a people that is primitive, because we say, well, their technology could be primitive, meaning not in the same sorts of technology that you might have in your culture, but people, when they use that term, often attribute it to their kinds of thinking. They have primitive minds. They don't understand things. Well, you know what? They have the same mind as everybody else does. And I think this image, young men of Papua New Guinea, this seems to me that this is more of a choice, that the figures in this painting are looking at us, the viewer. They are scantily clothed, so warm weather. which is a change from a lot of places in America, a lot of places in Europe. Scantily clothed, at the beach. So this is about connection between their culture and nature. But they are very unself-conscious. They are looking at us. They have made a choice, not a primitive choice, but I would argue a very complicated choice to live in the way that they are living. And this is not, they are looking at us not like, oh, hey, who are you? Or you shouldn't see us like this. But yeah, this is our culture. Why are you here? Cubism rejected the inherited concept that art should copy nature, or that they should adopt the traditional techniques of perspective, modeling, and foreshortening, reduced and fractured objects into geometric forms and then realign these within a shallow relief-like space. Use multiple or contrasting vantage points. A couple of examples for you. And I think you've probably heard of one of these. I referenced this painter earlier on, Picasso's Le Joueur de Guitare. Is this representational art? It gets a little bit more problematic. With some of the images, or maybe more of these images in Cubism, we might not understand what it is that we're looking at without a title. A tree is not a tree. A guitar player is not a guitar player, maybe without a little bit of a cue. The guitar player, and once we have this title, we can kind of make out the form of the guitar player. Cubism, these different vantage points. You look at one particular object and we think we're viewing it from one vantage point, but we look at another object and we have to sort of shift our gear. There's a kind of decenterizing, or decentering, I should say, feeling here. An instability of the way that we look at reality. Very modernist. George Brock's Mandora, 1910. Very famous, Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. This has certain elements of primitivism. This group of figures here, this group of women, scantily clad, wearing masks. Again, our view, it's difficult for us to look at the entirety of this painting. It doesn't make sense to us. We have to look at it from different points of view. And these are very unself-conscious figures here. Scantily clad, showing their nudity, not sort of hung up in whatever prohibitions of culture there might be. Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Stair. And this painting here, in part, is about movement of form. Again, fractured view, different vantage points on how we perceive reality, but also capturing a moment of movement. Destabilizing, uncertainty, modernism. Futurism, an Italian avant-garde art movement of the 20th century, celebrated advanced technology and urban modernity. So modernism and war and disillusionment and disconnect and all of those things, there was another side to it. There was also a celebration, in part by some writers and artists, a celebration of technology, to destroy older forms of culture and to demonstrate the beauty of modern life, the beauty of the machine, speed, violence, and change. Fascinated by the problems of representing the modern experience. To have their paintings evoke all kinds of sensations and not merely those visible to the eye. In part, maybe a little bit of a movement away from identifying what it is that is being shown and a movement towards the experience of viewing the art object itself. The City Rises, 1910, Umberto Boccioni's. Unique forms of continuity in space, another example of futurism. The Cyclist by Natalia Gonkarova, and Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash, Giacomo Bella. And again, this is about movement, capturing movement in a single glimpse of time. Constructivism, sort of sum this up. You'll have an opportunity to look through some of these slides, but less about aesthetics and more about understanding material objects. And these examples here are non-representational. Vasily Kandinsky's 1944. We can't identify what this is. We don't know if these are trees. We don't know if these are musical instruments. So we have moved towards the abstract. Ulysses beat the whites with the red wedge. We're not identifying objects in the painting by their geometric forms. We have reduced representation down to pure form. 1919. And Surrealism, one of the isms of the early 20th century. And these are images that many of us would be familiar with. This particular painting by Salvador Dali, and the next one that I'm going to show, this one being The Persistence of Memory. These two paintings were at one point two of the most popular posters to hang on, in college dorm rooms. Surrealism. To channel the unconscious as a means to unlock the power of the imagination. Psyche had the power to reveal the contradictions in the everyday world and spur on revolution, and revolutions could be found on the street and in everyday life. Let's look at this one. The Metamorphosis of Narcissists, Salvador Dali. Like all literary texts, I would suggest for us as well with artistic pieces, with paintings, photographs, any text, we look at the title, The Metamorphosis of Narcissists. So what does metamorphosis mean? Metamorphosis means change, significant change from one form to another. In terms of entomology, if we're thinking about insects, we have simple metamorphosis, we have complex metamorphosis, right? So maybe we can think about that in that way. Narcissus. I am giving this presentation right now towards the end of March, and there are things that are growing in the ground right now. You might not know that their name is Narcissus. What is Narcissus? A daffodil. Daffodils are yellow, they can be white and yellow. Narcissus daffodils are a fantastic early spring bulb. What's really fantastic about them is not only their color when everything else is still dormant, but deer don't like them. So they're a nice plant. What is this horticultural lesson? What is this all about? Well, Narcissus comes from a story in ancient Greece that there was you've heard of the expression, you are a narcissist. That Narcissus was a young boy in ancient Greece, and he came up to a stream and he fell in love with himself, and he stayed there looking at his own image until he died. And when he died, what sprang up were these flowers, and they were called Narcissus. All sorts of great flower myths from the ancient world. So here we are with the title, Metamorphosis of Narcissists, and what is going on here? We see on one half, so it looks like this painting is divided into two different halves. On one side, we have some sort of figure, looks like a stone, or it could be fingers in white holding an egg, and out of this egg comes some sort of flower. So this flower could be a daffodil. The coloration here, I think, is important. White, oftentimes we think of white being, and this is a good place to go to start, white being an archetypal image of purity and innocence. Does that help us understand this particular painting? I don't think that it does. Because what is also white? Bone is also white. Death is also white. The corpse is also white. And the image here over my shoulder of these fingers look very skeletal. And they stand in contrast to, again, the archetypal image of the egg. When we think of an egg, we think of spring, like the daffodil. We think of birth and rebirth and fertility and love and passion and all of those sorts of things. But this egg is small in comparison to what I would argue here are these skeletal or death-like fingers. So what could we say about this painting? Again, surrealist painting, modernist movement, early to mid 20th century. That life struggles in the face of death. We could make, I think, an interpretive point to something to that degree. What else do we have here? If we look over at my other shoulder, we seem to have a mirror image. This mirror image, the coloration is different. It is cast in more of a reddish hue. And the mirror image of the fingers, of these skeletal fingers, maybe on one side we can say this is life. This is life trying to struggle against death. On the other side of this painting, this mirror image cast in a reddish hue gives us a sense perhaps of transgression, hellish overtones, hell itself. And what Dali does, I think, so ingeniously when we look at this from different vantage points, we see that this is not only a reflection of the skeletal fingers, but also a human form, a person bent down, that the egg, the round figure, the round geometric shape, can be the figure's head leaning against this person's knee. What does this represent? It could represent lots of things. Sadness, melancholy, depression, transgression. Perhaps this is a social critique on the early 20th century. All right, what else do we have? As we come in for a landing, The Son of Man, René Magritte, 1964. A little bit outside of this modernist period, but also working within the modernist tradition. And I think this is the last slide here. René Magritte's let's try that again. The Treachery of Images. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. What is this? The Treachery of Images. The title of this is This Is Not a Pipe. This is, talk about vantage points. Talk about representation, reproduction, filtration of reality. What is it that we are looking at? Are we looking at a pipe? Yes. But no. We are looking at a reproduction of a pipe. We are looking at a representation of a pipe. We are told not only in the title, but the work itself has text. This is not a pipe. So we as the viewer have to struggle between the directive that this is not a pipe and the scopic field, what we understand through our visual gaze where we see a pipe. This is not a pipe that we can see or touch or feel in reality, rather a representation. And language becomes the filtration device with which we understand that reality. Again, a very classic modernist image. Okay, that'll conclude our presentation on modernism. Thank you.